All right, excellent. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the House Progressive Caucus. It is Tuesday, January 16th, 2024, and our caucus will have our usual guest panel on the topic of housing justice today. Before we get there, we'll just spend the first few minutes doing some caucus updates for the week ahead. But I want to start first by doing introductions of everyone in the room before we do that, so we know who's here. I'll begin. I'm State Representative Emma Mulvaney-Stanek. I represent Chittenden 17, which is a portion of Burlington, and I am the caucus leader for the House Progressives.
Good afternoon, everyone. Representative Taylor Small from Winooski. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Progressive Caucus leader.
Please add your pronouns if you choose to. I use she, her as well.
Good morning, afternoon. Representative Hedrick, I represent a portion of Burlington. He and him pronouns work well for me.
Hi, I'm Agatha Kessler, and I'm a candidate for Sergeant at Arms, and I prefer she and her.
I'm Steve Finner. I'm a volunteer lobbyist from Barry, and he, him, his.
In here, Steve.
Representative Robin Chestnut Tangerman, Rutland Bennington District, the southern part of the state. Use he, him pronouns.
Josh Ronsky. I am the Executive Director of the Vermont Progressive Party and providing staff support to the House Progressive Caucus.
And we'll go online. Jess?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jess Hyman from CVOEO. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also on the board of the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont.
Yes, and Will?
Hey, afternoon, folks. Will Lambeck with Migrant Justice, and I'll be joined in a little bit by my colleague, Rosie.
Awesome, great. And we'll have Rosie do their introduction when we get there. We have just a couple of logistics. And do I have any other House Caucus members or House members?
And I just add, I'm also the vice chair of the Barry City Homelessness Task Force.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that work. We also have in this caucus usually Kate Logan, a representative from Burlington, and Brian Chena, another representative from Burlington. I think they both had conflicts at this time. And sometimes we also are joined by other House members because we are open caucus. So if there's anyone else online, please say so. Otherwise, I will keep going. Okay, great. Okay. So a few leadership updates. Thank you to Representative Small for standing in for me this morning with House leadership notes. Just a quick reminder about decorum on the House floor, making sure that we write down vote explanations and that they are short and infrequent and strategically used, and that you speak through the speaker, amongst other things. So we had a really great and healthy floor debate last week on an important bill, and just a reminder about dusting off our decorum skills. I want to just do a shout out. Thank you to the drafting work. There's been, I don't know if it's a record. It feels like we're pushing a record number of bills being introduced this session. Come on in, Mike, come join us at the table. And just a big thank you to Caitlin, who must be a staffer. Representative Small, do you want to? Staff deserve praise. So who is Caitlin?
Caitlin is the staffer. Okay. The speaker is specifically highlighted when thinking about drafting. But gosh, it is a team of them down there, and they have been working, as we've seen, with over 100 bills introduced and trickling down to about 30 today. They've been working hard.
We're in the 800s at this point, between the two sessions. And then just briefly, we have a discrimination prevention training next Tuesday as House members. The crossover date hasn't been announced yet, but it's coming soon. And then there'll be the joint assembly with the Senate and House together for the governor's budget address next Tuesday. So those are all the leadership announcements. And we will just go around to caucus members and any guests around any updates on bills or introductions.
I don't have anything new from last week.
I don't have anything new except for celebrating H72, passing the House with a very strong vote. Look forward to that moving forward. Thank you. And our committee will be working expeditiously on S18, the flavored tobacco ban, as well as coming up with an interim solution and addressing homelessness. So this is a very timely conversation to be having.
Great. And extra praise to Representative Small. Not only was H72 her bill as lead sponsor, but she really held her own on the floor. And it was a thing of beauty to see her really handle that so graciously and smartly and articulately. No surprise.
Clinic.
Yay, well done, well done.
Thank you.
So with that, let us go to our topic of the day for our guest panel around housing. I called it housing justice on the House floor when I announced this. And what we'd really love to do between now, we have 3 guests, maybe 4th if Rosie joins us. Rebecca Palmer from Vermont Legal Aid has joined us. And Rebecca, we did introductions, so I'll give you the first bite at the apple in a moment here to introduce yourself and your pronouns if you choose. We are very curious as a caucus around housing policy in general, and yet as the progressives, a commitment to economic justice and housing justice is really critical for us. And actually, I'm going to stop right there because we have our Sergeant of Arms candidates here, and my brain is clearly not been fed yet. So I'm going to pause our guest panel for just 2 more minutes because we have an opening of the Sergeant of Arms role within the State House, and we have 2 candidates, known candidates so far, who've joined us in our space. Thank you so much for coming to our small but mighty caucus, and I'd love for you to introduce yourselves just a little bit more, perhaps while you're running, and then if any of us have questions, we can ask questions. So thank you, guest panels, for just holding on for a couple more minutes here. So Agatha, do you want to go first?
Sure, yes, I can start. I'm Agatha Kessler, and a candidate for Sergeant at Arms, and I believe, were you all at the Democratic Caucus? So you've heard a little bit about what Mike and I, why we're running for Sergeant at Arms. I will say Caitlin and that operations team is probably working super hard. I've been back there during the frenzy. I was on the hiring panel for Caitlin and brought her on board, and she was able to transition from seasonal to full-time work, and now she supervises the entire team. And they do so much work back there, the document going from an editor to a lawyer to a drafting technician, editor, lawyer, maybe a dozen times before a legislator even sees it. So it is a lot of work. So I'm Agatha Kessler running for Sergeant at Arms.
I'm Mike Brunt, running for Sergeant at Arms, and I agree with everything you said about drafting operations and Caitlin, that team back there. I spoke at the Democrat/Progressive Caucus, I guess, earlier with you folks there, and the Republican Caucus, and kind of outlined what I see as the most pressing issues for the State House and the Sergeant at Arms role going forward. A little bit about myself. I have a long history of working with youth, and so I'm really excited about the PAGE program. Boy State, Girl State, but also those broader youth programs that can come into the State House. I think getting young people excited about government is really important. And so I'm looking forward to that. The new chief of police is probably going to start around the same time as the new Sergeant at Arms. And so those two working together and having a good relationship going forward is going to be really important to the security of the State House.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll just kick off with just one quick question because I wasn't able to go to the joint, I don't know, we were visitors to the Democratic Caucus. I'm just curious, Agatha, because haven't been able to have a chance to work with you before. Can you just give just like a 1-minute background? Because I know you were in the building prior at some point before I was at least in office. Yeah.
Yes, I started as a drafting technician, the work that we were talking about, Caitlin. My supervisor was a woman named Demis Martin, who worked at the State House for 40 years and is like icon status. She taught me so much about respect for the institution. Then I was a committee assistant for the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, and the chair was Senator Ayer and another woman that's kind of a mentor, very classy, very professional, and she taught me and everyone in the committee room about a well-run committee. Every person who walks into the committee room is a guest, and you treat them as a guest. Then I was the supervisor for the committee staff. So another icon, her name was Shirley Adams. She worked for the legislature for 40 years and she retired. She was the House Commerce Committee assistant. And when she retired, they asked if I'd be the supervisor of the committee staff. And that was a lot of fun, supervising 20 seasonal employees. And the committee staff, I always call them the central nervous system of the building because they are doing so much work behind the scenes. They're talking to each other. They're sharing resources. They'll say, oh, you've got Jen Kirby in your committee. I need her downstairs as soon as you're done. And they're constantly working and putting feelers out. And it's a seasonal job with no benefits and it's not paid very well. I think you all can probably relate to that. And then when Janet was elected to be Sergeant at Arms in 2015, I think it was, she was the Deputy Director of Operations when she was elected. Then I was appointed to Deputy Director of Operations. And I mentioned it this morning. Back then, the office was called Office of Legislative Counsel, and it had 56 employees, the IT operations and committee staff, and I supported those 56 staff, and I was the HR department. And we did a lot of fun stuff during that time, and a lot of the systems that we put into place are still in place today. The example I gave this morning was the committee web pages, was something that we developed and got off the ground. And now the committees are paperless, which is pretty cool. So we took filing cabinets out of committee rooms. It was like the proudest day. Like, it was like a parade of filing cabinets coming out of the State House, because it symbolized like no more need for paper, more room for people in the committee rooms. It's pretty cool.
A few more happy trees.
Yes.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Members, do you have any questions for our two Sergeant of Arms candidate guests? We have them.
I do not. I do just want to say you both had phenomenal presentations during the Democratic Caucus. That really gave a full wraparound view of not only what you have done, but where the State House will be going in the future. And I just want to say, like, I think there's a lot of confidence that no matter who is selected as Sergeant at Arms, we're going to be in really cared for hands. So thank you both for stepping forward.
Thank you.
It's really nice. Thank you.
And I want to just say that, you know, Sergeant at Arms is a very military sounding title. And of course, security is a piece of it, but just a piece. And so much of it is the support and the unseen support and nurturing of us, of staff. It's really appreciate you both wanting to do that.
Well, on that note, one of the first mentions and historical references of the title Sergeant at Arms was in 1415. The British House of Commons appointed a retired soldier to look over order and decorum in the castle while the king was away. And so that was kind of the first known reference of it. And think about today, the Sergeant at Arms is responsible for order and decorum in the people's house, and hasn't changed too much, a little bit.
Great. If there are not any other questions from any legislator here, then we can move on and thank our candidates so much for coming. We really appreciate it. We feel seen as the House Progressive Caucus. Thank you for seeing us.
Thank you for
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so now we have a couple other legislators and guests who've joined us, so welcome. I'm glad you're here. So now we'll switch gears and go to our guest panel and topic for today. Thank you, guests, for hanging in there while we put that quick agenda item in. My agenda, but I didn't say a break. So again, we're going to be talking about housing policy, and true to this caucus's core values is around really understanding how policy work is intersectional and the need for understanding economic justice, social justice, and how that shows up in the policies that we pass in the building. So we have a real keen interest in affordability and renters' rights, and those folks who are often marginalized. Hi, Molly, on the margins of our communities, and the plight of housing, frankly, that I'm assuming is even more intensified for folks when we have such a housing emergency underway in this entire state. So we're joined by three panelists today, and maybe a fourth if Rosie's joining us. You can let me know, Will. We have Jess Hyman, who's the Associate Director of the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. We have Will Lambert and maybe Rosie from Migrant Justice, an organization that helps folks who are not just, I would imagine, agricultural workers, but folks who are undocumented in our well, you're going to give your mission. I don't want to, I'm going to totally mess it up. I really respect and appreciate your work. And you also have some housing and education bills that you're keen on introducing to all legislators. And then Rebecca Pumler from Vermont Legal Aid. And Rebecca, I don't have your official title, but I'm sure you're an amazing leader and advocate from Vermont Legal Aid to help round out this conversation. And what we would love to do is each give you 2 to 3 minutes or so. We'll loosely time, so don't feel like I'm going to cut you off at 3 minutes, but to give us an idea of what issues you are most focused on this session in the grand kind of big umbrella of housing justice, things that our caucus should be aware of, and then we'll spend the last 20 or 30 minutes with some dialogue back and forth with any legislator or guest being able to ask questions and engage as well. I thought maybe we'd start first with Jess, if that's okay with everybody, and then we'll go to Migrant Justice and then to Legal Aid if that works for everybody. Okay, great. Okay, so Jess, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join today. I really appreciate it, as well as your ongoing attention to housing justice issues. So what I'd like to do is just share briefly what we're hearing from renters, some trends in our hotlines, and some related both CVOEO and HHAV, Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont, legislative priorities, and share some thoughts on what's needed, what we think is needed to strengthen renters' rights and protections. And of course, I welcome your questions after. Just a quick correction. I'm the Associate Director of CVOEO's statewide housing advocacy programs, not of the whole organization, just of our statewide programs, which includes programs that support and work with renters, with people experiencing discrimination in their housing, with folks living in mobile home communities, and also with asylum seekers and people in our new home family housing voucher program, which is a rapid rehousing program for families experiencing homelessness. So I'm guessing that folks are familiar with CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, but just in case you're not, we have 9 interconnected client-centered programs and services that combat poverty, work towards racial, social, economic, and environmental justice, and also help people achieve economic independence. We serve more than 10,000 households and more than 20 individuals every year. Most of our programs are focused in the 4 counties of Addison, Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties, and then our statewide housing advocacy programs that I mentioned earlier are throughout the entire state. So all of our services are grounded in the belief that housing is a basic human right and that everyone deserves equitable access to securing and maintaining a home free from discrimination. And we approach this work from an information sharing and skill and relationship building perspective. And so we're really in favor of policies that don't just address the current crisis, but have longer term stability and retention and strategies to increase the amount of perpetually affordable housing as well. And in this, we're painfully aware of the power dynamic at play in housing relationships and how that can impact renters, and especially renters who are traditionally subject to discrimination and exclusion. Black and Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ plus folks, families with children, people with disabilities, people who've experienced trauma, and other vulnerable populations. So as we all know, this housing crisis we're in is affecting everybody, but it's affecting the most vulnerable even more. So every day on our tenants hotline, we're hearing from people who are at risk of losing their housing because of huge rent increases. We're hearing daily about leases that are being renewed with $100, $200, $300, $500 increases in rent. We're also hearing a lot more about no-cause evictions. We hear from elderly people who are living without heat or hot water and can't get local officials to enforce basic health and safety regulations. We hear from immigrants and refugees who are putting up with substandard living conditions or being harassed by landlords, but are afraid to complain out of fear of retaliation. And we hear from people who can't understand important documents and notices that come to them from their landlords and property management because these notices are only in English, as well as people with disabilities who are being denied basic accommodations that would allow them to live safe and comfortably in their home. So these bullet categories, I was looking at my notes when I came and spoke with you last year. They're the same bullets as last year. These are the same issues. These things are not changing. What's different is we're hearing a lot more. So our statewide Vermont Tenants Hotline, which hears from renters all over the state, has had we've had double the amount of calls last year than we had in 2018. It's steadily increased every year since 2018, up to more than 1,500 calls last year from people who were calling to talk about how they've been treated, to ask questions about their lease, to report inhabitable conditions and other issues. And some of the highest increase in calls we've seen have been related to eviction, with a significant increase in the proportion of those related to illegal evictions. This includes tenants being locked out of their apartments, being left without fuel tanks or water supply, folks facing landlord harassment, and people who are being given false information about the eviction process. We've also been hearing a lot more about from general lease questions and, as I said before, habitability issues. And so we're able to counsel people on their rights and responsibilities and make referrals and provide education, connect people to resources, but it's really often not enough. There needs to be more action taken to stabilize and improve the current housing market and to increase housing stability and retention. So I have to admit, things have been moving really fast in the legislature this session, and I just received this invitation to join you yesterday, so I haven't had time to go over and look at all the stuff that's being proposed, but I'll just briefly mention a few of CVOEO's and HHAV's priorities related to renters and speak to a few specific bills. I'm not going to dig into our shared priorities for the need to accelerate the production of affordable housing with a focus on perpetually affordable housing, and of course, full statutory support for VHB. And I won't dive into reimagining general assistance and the Act 81 related policy. And a lot of those conversations are ongoing. And I'd encourage you to have another session just focused on those. But thinking about things specifically related to renters. On the CVOEO side, of course, we want to see more permanent housing, more appropriate emergency shelters and supports. We need additional services to support the renters who are out there. Like I said, our statewide hotline gets 1,500 and more calls every year. We have one full-time staff member serving all of the renters of the state. And we have backup staff as well. And there's an incredible need for more the ability to share immediate information with folks and resources, but also to help with those follow-up services that need to happen. We would like to see increased statewide funding for stability retention services so we can prevent homelessness, so we can ensure that people can stay safely and sustainably housed. We would also see more eviction protections, establish statewide just cause eviction. That would go a long way towards ensuring housing stability and preventing arbitrary and also harmful terminations of tenancy. We really support eviction diversion programs, mediation programs, anything that can help build relationships between landlords and tenants. Because often something that's a really small issue that could be addressed with a conversation, with some better communication, spirals into something bigger and ends up affecting people's housing stability. We would like to see the fair housing protected classes expanded to include citizenship and immigration status, as well as there's some other protections being proposed for folks without U.S. citizenship status. We would very much like to see some rent stabilization policy being enacted. That would go a long way as well. And some other protections that would be really useful, which would be things like requiring any landlord who's receiving state funding through, for example, VHIP, the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, or other programs, and other incentive programs, requiring these landlords to receive basic landlord, tenant, and fair housing education so they can start their relationship with their renters fully knowing their rights and responsibilities. I know I'm going a little bit over time, but let's see. The other thing I just want to mention are a few specific bills. There's H617, which would clearly define residential application fees. I think that's a really important bill. Right now, there's a little bit of a muddy area around fees that are associated with rental applications, like background and credit check fees, and whether or not those are included under the state's prohibition on applications fees. We say yes, they do count as application fees and should not be allowed. There are a few other acts like H618 related to the definition of a mobile home park, which we think will be very valuable, and also H619, the act related to creating reciprocal rights to landlord, tenant, attorneys' fees and expenses, which we also support because that evens the playing field a bit. There are a lot more bills I know that have just been introduced. I'm happy to speak to them specifically in the Q&A portion, but I will just thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I really, applaud both your caucus's focus and the other speakers' focus on addressing the needs of the most vulnerable in our communities and keeping justice and equity at the forefront of any housing legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. And we'll hold our questions until the end. And I also just want to note that I see Will doing some interpretation. So if we can leave a little bit more time so that I'm sure this is inclusive for Rosie and vice versa, so we can make sure that. So Will and Rosie, welcome so much. Thank you for being here. And we'd love to hear migrant justice priorities and what you all are focusing on.
¿Cuál es su enfoque este año?
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Rosy Alfaro y soy parte de Justicia Migrante.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, rather. My name is Rosie Alfaro. I'm part of Migrant Justice.
Tal vez muchos ya conocen a Justicia Migrante, pero quiero dar un pequeño resumen sobre lo que es Justicia Migrante.
I think many of you already know who Migrant Justice is, but I'll just give a brief summary of the organization.
Pues Justicia Migrante es una organización creada y liderada más que nada por la comunidad migrante.
Migrant Justice is an organization founded and led by the immigrant community in Vermont.
Y nos enfocamos más en los derechos humanos.
And our focus is on human rights.
Sí, pues entonces eso es lo que es un poco de Justicia Migrante. Y pues ahora voy a pasar sobre las viviendas.
So now I'd like to talk about the issue of housing.
¿Cuál es la importancia realmente para nosotros el proyecto de las viviendas? Que como en mi persona he tenido como testimonios.
So why are we proposing a bill around housing this session? I can speak from my personal experience and my testimony.
De que es muy complicado y muy difícil que nosotros podamos tener donde vivir.
It's very difficult for us to find a place to live in this state.
En mi experiencia estuve más de un año pues sin conseguir una vivienda. Muchos como todo el tiempo me pedían como un seguro y también el hablar inglés y esas personas que exigen el seguro no confían en uno.
It took me and my family more than a year to find rental housing in this state. And every place I applied to, there would be language barriers and they would ask me for a social security number. And you'd see the lack of trust they had when I wasn't able to present one.
Sí, estuve más de un año sin tener una vivienda, tengo 3 hijos y pues más que nada fue como un descontrol también como en la escuela con ellos.
And so I was over a year without permanent housing because of that. And my 3 kids really suffered because they weren't able to be enrolled steadily in just one school district because we were moving.
Es muy complicado de que puedan confiar en nosotros sin tener un seguro. Nosotros queremos que pase ese proyecto de las viviendas, que ya no pidan como más papeles, el cual nosotros no podemos tener.
And so that's why we're proposing a bill this session to prevent landlords from requesting a social security number during the rental application and to accept other identity documents.
Sí, porque es muy complicado. En mi persona pude apenas hace unos meses tener una vivienda donde vivir, pero pues fue con otra persona, como con un aval que firmara de que yo puedo entrar a vivir en esa casa.
And so finally, I was able to find permanent rental housing, but only when I had a guarantor on my application, somebody who signed on my behalf.
Sí, y no soy la única persona que ha pasado esta experiencia, sino que también en la comunidad, compañeros de nosotros, también muchos de nosotros han pasado lo mismo, que no tienen dónde vivir, por lo mismo que pues nos exigen el seguro.
And I'm not the only person who's experienced this. A large and growing number of members in our community who are looking to rent housing on the market in Vermont are running into these barriers.
Sí, entonces por eso para nosotros es importante que pase ese proyecto para que pues se nos facilite un poquito más y dejemos de tanto sufrir como ya lo hemos hecho.
And so that's why we are hopeful that this bill will move forward so that we aren't suffering from a lack of access to housing.
Sí, como ya mencioné, no soy la única persona, muchos de la comunidad están pasando también por esto y sí, necesitamos esto porque es algo muy importante.
And again, this isn't just something that I myself have experienced or my family, but this has become an increasing problem for our community.
Y pues no solo son las viviendas, también quiero hablar un poquito sobre la educación.
I'd like to take a brief moment to talk about a related issue of access to higher education.
Sí, pues ya mencioné, tengo 3 hijos y no solamente yo soy una madre de familia, sino también muchas mujeres de aquí de la comunidad.
And so, as I said, I have 3 children myself. I'm not the only parent in our community. Many people have school-age children right now.
Hay muchos niños que aún quieren seguir y anhelan seguir estudiando, terminar una carrera, una universidad, y han terminado como con una carrera trunca, no han podido seguir más adelante.
And there are many children in the community who would like to access higher education, to get professional training, to have a professional career from a college or university, but whose dreams have been cut short because of lack of access.
Sí. Es muy triste ver a esos niños que se quedan con sus sueños truncados, que no pueden avanzar más.
And it's really sad when you see children in our community whose dreams are being deferred because of a lack of access to education.
Y lo que realmente anhelan es seguir estudiando, es superarse y mejorarse como persona.
Because the hope of higher education is to continue growing as a person and to make something of yourself in this life.
Y por eso es de que también estoy aquí para hablar sobre eso, no solo en mi persona, sino también representando a mi comunidad, porque es muy importante para nuestros hijos.
And that's why, on behalf of my community, I'm here to talk about the issue of education as well for our children.
Sí, y pues sí, quisiera que también aprueben ese proyecto de la educación para que no solo mis hijos, sino que la mayoría de los niños que anhelan tener sus estudios, una educación mejor, puedan salir en adelante.
And so that's why I hope that this caucus will be able to support a bill that we're proposing to increase access to higher education for children in immigrant communities. Gracias. Thanks, Rosie, and I'll just add a little bit to myself. And I'm sorry, I'd hope to maybe put some links in the chat, but I see that that's not made available on this meeting, but I can share them by email after. So the access to higher education bill that Rosie spoke about, the second one, that has been introduced as H817 in House Education. And I think I see Representative Dodge at the end of the table there. Hi, Leonora. She is one of the principal sponsors on the bill. And I know that many of you are already co-sponsors, but she can share more information about that. And then regarding housing, we're really interested in talking with you about these 2 provisions that Rosie mentioned, and which you also heard about from the previous speaker. CVOEO is supporting this bill as well, as is the Human Rights Commission and many other organizations. So there are 2 provisions. One, to add immigration status as a protected class in the Fair Housing Bill or the Fair Housing Act. And 2, to prohibit landlords from requesting a Social Security number in the rental application process. And we have a backgrounder that we can share with you via email with the exact language. Those provisions, our understanding is that they are being included in the Be Home bill, principally sponsored by Senator Ram Hinsdale in Senate Economic Development. So interested in hearing from the caucus, sort of your thoughts on that overall bill, if you're familiar with it, as I imagine many of you are, and you may be able to provide us additional information on sort of what pathway that bill will be taking. For now, those provisions are embedded within it. At some point, they may be spun out, but for the moment, they'll be contained within that bill.
Great. Thank you, Rosie, and thank you, Will. Appreciate that overview. And then last but not least, Rebecca, welcome. And you can also we just did introductions of names and pronouns if you choose to share. That's the only part you missed before I forgot about sergeants of arms. So Rebecca, thank you for being here. And if you could share legal aid's priorities and focus.
Thank you so much. And I am sorry for being a little bit late. Jess, I really appreciate sent me the information about this just a little while ago. And so I appreciate you including me at the last moment. My name is Rebecca Plummer. My pronouns are she, her. I am the director of the Medical Legal Partnership Project at Vermont Legal Aid and taking a lead in some housing and homelessness work in the State House this session. And one of the ways in which I became particularly connected with emergency housing work was that I was my most recent casework was in a medical legal partnership that was working with people in medication assisted treatment. And those are some of the most marginalized people in our society, and there was a lot of overlap with emergency housing and homelessness cases. And Vermont Legal Aid does a lot and has done a lot of eviction defense, and it's one of the core pieces of what we do. I want to just say we agree with and support most of the things that Jess was talking about. Generally, we of course would support the H817 that Will and Rosie were talking about. We are part of the HHAV coalition. And so we support the platform that HHAV has put forward, and that they are, that's constantly evolving as we work on BAA and things that are moving at this point. But I would say, just to our emphasis, a couple of points of emphasis for us are eviction is rising in the middle of a really dire housing crisis. So for us, eviction prevention is, it's really important to see that eviction prevention is homelessness prevention. If you're evicted in this current crisis, there's nowhere to go. There's just nowhere to go. And Jess is talking about the increased number of calls about eviction, and the eviction rate, the filing of eviction cases is rising since the end of the moratorium in 2021. So one of our main hopes for this session is that S100, or Act 47, it became when it was passed last session, that it be funded, that the eviction prevention measures within it be funded. They were not funded. And those are primarily a rental arrears fund. This is incredibly important. VRAP has ended, and a lot of the increase in evictions is because it's not possible to resolve non-payment evictions with some relatively small amount of funding that VRAP was providing before. And so our hope is that there can be funding for a rental arrears fund that would be for qualifying households up to 80% of area median income. So that would cover a lot more folks than the HOP program. And to help people just stay in their homes and resolve non-payment issues. A lot of times that non-payment occurs because of a short-term, a temporary crisis. That's not always true. Rents have gone up an incredible amount, 45% in the last few years. I don't have that stat right in front of me. And of course, that is just absolutely unworkable for many people. But it is possible to resolve a lot of evictions or potential evictions through rental arrears fund and the other two prongs of Act 47 that I'll mention in a moment, to allow people to make plans, figure out what they're doing. Sometimes that means it's not a tenable tenancy and they need to figure out another place, or ideally a subsidy. But sometimes it means that they can just get over it and they can avoid being thrown out of their homes and into homelessness. So the second part of the Act 47 is eviction diversion. And this would be a statewide specialist on programs that would help landlords and tenants resolve problems before eviction. And then the third one is a tenant full representation pilot project in a couple of counties. And this would provide representation through the entire case, which helps really resolve a lot of eviction cases, and work things out between landlords and tenants and avoid, the trauma and displacement. We also I'll just mention briefly our supporting HHEV's request for funding through the BAA to keep everyone who's currently in emergency housing and who becomes eligible for that over the next couple of months in this current fiscal year, state fiscal year, sheltered through the end of the fiscal year, and then a big, concerted effort to make sure that we create a modernized and effective emergency housing shelter program that makes sense and is dignified and protective of people in a housing crisis where, as I said, there's just nowhere to go until all of the new housing that needs to get created gets created. And then finally, just a very quick word that there is a H629. This is about home ownership, not about renters particularly, but it's about low income home ownership, people who get behind in their property taxes. And we have, there's a bill about just some common sense measures to prevent people from losing their homes for very small amounts of tax debt, which does happen. People losing all of the equity in their homes, of $150,000 or so for debts of, less than $1,000 or a couple of $1,000s. So some protections in there to help people avoid that. Those are our biggest priorities. And thank you for
Thank you. Thank you to all four of you for sharing. There's so much, and this really shows, frankly, this is our only conversation around housing. There's so many different moving parts. I wanted to kick off. We have about 10, maybe actually more like 9 minutes before we have to hike back through the snow to the State House because many of us have things at 1 o'clock. So we'll see where we get, and we might invite you all. We hopefully will invite you all back to continue the conversation, especially as things start to pick up and move, hopefully in the building, and how we can be helpful. But my first question, I'm going to kick it off, is there is a new bill. There are 3 existing bills for charter changes around just cause eviction from Burlington, Winooski, and Essex. But there is now another bill that's up on the wall, 616, which is a moratorium bill on evictions. And I'm wondering if anyone on the call wants to briefly just comment on your take on that, if it's strong enough, if it's how that plays into towns doing something frankly stronger and better, but it also is statewide. So I'm just curious what your take on that bill is. And if you haven't seen it yet, no worries, but just curious if that's come across your radar yet.
I'll give a quick perspective and then I turn it over to Rebecca for more in depth as a lawyer. And so we definitely support it. I mean, obviously we would love to see a strong statewide just cause eviction policy enacted, but I think there will be some challenges to that. So the bill, the 616, I think is a really good start and would give folks just that little bit of breathing room to be able to manage the immediate housing crisis. So we would definitely support that.
Thanks, Jess. Rebecca?
Absolutely. I don't think I would really say anything different from what Jess just said. I mean, I do think that it is, just cause is not, it is going to take a while, probably. That's obviously what we would support. That would make a lot of sense. Other states have it. But in the meantime, this is really important. This could be very helpful to slow things down as evictions rise, and it can really be explained as a to those who are less likely to support changes to or limitations on landlords' abilities to get people out, that this is a crisis we're in. So this is a temporary measure to slow things down when there is nowhere to go. So I don't know the answer or a point of view on what you were asking about how it would affect charter changes, positively or negatively. It's
right, and they both can move independent of each other, and that's not always how it works in this building. So I'll leave it at that. Other caucus members, but also our colleagues who have questions for our panel. Representative Small.
Thank you. And thank you all again for being here. Will, in particular, it was great to see migrant justice in the building yesterday. Not yesterday, it was last week. What is time anyway? Feels like yesterday. I wish you were here today. And being able to hear about these bills and especially the concerns from our migrant workers and thinking about what housing situations are. We hear often about the housing situations for Vermonters generally, but talking about those who are more marginalized and have fear around going to their landlord about the conditions that they're living in. And really happy to hear that Senator Keisha Hinsdale is including this in the Be Home Act. Just to respond to your question, it's an omnibus bill. It's going to be packed with a lot of different housing priorities in there. So I think that's what we saw last year with Act 47, which I looked up as the Home Act. I've only heard it described as the Home Act, so I didn't know the number. But I think there's going to be a lot of active discussion around it. But if it's coming over already in the Senate, I think that's an encouraging note to start on. And I'll speak for myself, but I think I can speak on behalf of the caucus and knowing that that will be a priority for us to maintain in that bill, as well as other protections for renters more generally.
Go ahead. Yeah. I have one other question, so I want to hopefully squeeze it into. Go ahead, Steve. Yep.
Yeah, a couple of quick comments. Just first, I just read 616, and my initial thought was, gee, if we could just slide that into 719, would stand a much better chance of getting home. It looks like Montpelier is going to pass no cause. Yeah, thank you. At town meeting day in Barry, I'll be taking poison before it happens. You have a lot of, but the word that I heard, I believe it was Ms. Plummer used about dignity. Mm-hmm. The one thing I keep hearing from people in the budget inn where I have a friend living and a couple others is that feeling that they are being defined as less than. Mm-hmm. And it's just, all I can do is make a comment. I don't know what, I'm 85. There ain't going to be no fix before I pass. But anything that we can do to shore people up that we're not, it's the same thing about charity is giving people what's yours, justice is giving people what's theirs. And decent, affordable housing is a justice issue, not a charity issue. End of rant and sermon. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Glad you're here. Does anyone else have a question before I jump on my second one?
I have a comment.
Yep.
Just being on the housing committee, when we will be making our working this afternoon on our Budget Adjustment Act letter, and our number one ask is for the funding for the policies that were in the Home Act and didn't get funded. The housing, the rent eviction diversion trio of packages. So that's our number one ask. There'll be other ones in there too for larger amounts of funding for the housing programs, but the priority is to fund that trio of eviction diversion bills.
Great. Thanks, Robin. And this might be too big of a question to ask with like 1 minute left. And so Will in migrant justice, but also maybe the legal aid a little bit as well. And Will and my wife were having a bit of a conversation about something that happened in my neighborhood. But it led me to understand and see firsthand around a problematic, I'm hoping it's not a trend, but it probably is, of employers buying or renting apartments and packing workers into those apartments. Talk about lacking dignity. But I feel and fear that this is happening in the shadows of Vermont, and this is in Burlington, not to mention, of course, the long plight that we've known from farm workers who are in employer-provided housing of low quality in many cases, and I fear, again, for safety and dignity of those workers as well. So I guess it's just an open question of, what and how do we do and address I'll use the word exploitation of workers and that power dependency. Because certainly I know that probably not a single one of those workers could afford the rent, because I know that building in my neighborhood. It is charging way too much rent for anyone to live there. And yet there are people living and being exploited by this very hot housing emergency situation. So I'm just any brief, are you observing that? And how do we really address that and bring that to the light of day?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. A big issue. I'll try to be brief on it, and I think it sort of speaks to this fundamental element of what's going on here. Is Vermont saying we need to build more housing? Who's building housing? It's going to be it already is and will increasingly be immigrant laborers. A lot of people who are settling directly from Latin America, many people who have been in the U.S. and are now making Vermont their second settlement in the U.S. coming up from Massachusetts or other places in southern New England and elsewhere. And almost all of those workers are living in housing provided by employers. So we see the construction industry sort of taking the model of the dairy industry of saying, if we want low-wage immigrant workers, we're going to provide them housing, and that's going to be our draw to get them here. And so as we talk about the need to build more housing, renovate housing in Vermont, there needs to be a recognition of who the labor force is, who it will continue to be, and make sure that we're not creating this sort of like cruelly ironic situation of the folks who are going to be building housing to address Vermont's housing crisis are being placed into that crisis themselves. So big issues, but we think that the bill that's being proposed goes a long way towards addressing that, of creating an alternative where workers don't have to rely on employer-provided housing because they aren't being shut out of the rental market due to discrimination and requests for Social Security numbers.
Can I just add something?
Please. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you guys introduce yourselves before you just don't want to do it the wrong way? Sorry.
Representative.
That's fine. I just want to say that I'm also seeing this broadly in Chittenden County, where we didn't usually see, it wasn't on people's radars, and not only are we seeing like workers, our workforce, but families are traveling and settling here. And it's, access to schools, access to enrolling your kids. There are so many barriers. Access to transportation has become hugely, hugely important, that we are really dragging the capacity, we're exploding the capacity of the nonprofits and the agencies that are supposed to be helping, UVM Extension. They went from having all dairy farm, clients at UVM Extension, like the Bridges to Health, to having 50%. And then the other 50% is no longer dairy clients living, so it's and from having like almost no kids to having 130 kids that they serve. And so we really have to think about the children. And if we are not just having folks come and we're going to just exploit their labor and, which is akin to slavery, then we have to take into account their entire humanity, their whole personhood, and the fact that they need education, housing, basic civil rights, and all of the things that we try to guarantee for the rest of Vermont. Regardless of migration status, we have got to recognize the same rights that we are fighting so hard for all Vermonters, for all of these families that are coming in.
And I'll just end, because we have to wrap up, by saying I serve on House Commerce, which does workforce, and we talk so much about the shortages, right? So what fills that shortage, of course, are also workers coming in, and yet we don't talk about them with the same attention and care, et cetera. And I think it would be great, House Commerce, to have a hearing around the folks who are the new workers migrating here, and what are their living conditions, but frankly, what are also their employment issues, which should probably be a whole other session, because I've seen some of the buildings that these folks are working on, and it is not safe, to put it very lightly. And I have deep concerns about that. I'm sure my caucus does as well.
Yep.
All right, sorry to rush the end there, but we do have to put our boots on and trudge through the snow. Thank you very much for our guests coming. We appreciate you. Betsy Ann, thank you for running tech for us.